The water hit me before the sentence did. I felt it soak through my shirt, drip off my jaw, and pool at the collar of the one good suit I owned. I stood in the executive office of Ardenvale Holdings, 31 floors above downtown Charlotte, holding a sealed board folder in one hand, and I did not move. I did not flinch. I let the silence do what silence does best. It made the room listen. Elise Harrington stood on the other side of her desk, glass still tilted in her hand, chest rising fast. She was 35, sharp-featured, dressed like she'd been born in a boardroom, and right now she looked at me the way you look at something you're certain is a threat. "Who sent you?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as one. I didn't answer right away. At 58, I've learned that the fastest way to lose a room is to explain yourself to someone who's already decided who you are. So I stood there, water dripping onto the folder in my hand, and I let her wait. That's when the door opened behind me. Roland Pierce walked, in the way he did everything unhurried, like time bent around him instead of the other way. He was somewhere in his early 60s, silver at the temples, the kind of man whose calm made other people nervous. He looked at the water on my collar. He looked at Elise. And then, in a voice with no heat in it at all, he said the sentence that would end up rewriting both our lives. "He's here for your job." Elise's glass hit the desk so hard I thought it would crack. "What?" I said nothing. Because the truth was, I didn't fully understand it either. 3 days earlier, Roland Pierce had called me himself. Not an assistant. Not a recruiter. Him. I'd spent the last 2 decades pulling companies back from the edge, walking into operations that everyone else had already written obituaries for, and finding the one broken gear nobody thought to check. Roland told me he wanted my read on a situation. He never used the word CEO. He never mentioned Elise Harrington by name. I assumed I was walking into a consulting conversation, the kind I'd had 100 times before, a chairman looking for an outside opinion before making a hard call. I had no idea I was walking into an execution. I almost didn't take the call at all. I'd spent the last few years turning down more work than I accepted, choosing carefully, the way you do once you've buried the version of yourself that thought success meant saying yes to everything. I raised my daughter alone after I lost my wife, and there was a decade of my life where every decision ran through one question. First, will this take me away from home when it matters? She's grown now, out in the world building a life of her own, and I don't regret a single hour I spent choosing her over a boardroom. But that decade taught me something about patience, about reading a room before you speak in it, about not mistaking someone's confidence for the truth just because it's delivered smoothly. It's the same instinct I carried into that office the day the water hit my face. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest reaction in a room is rarely the correct one. "You can't be serious," Elise said, and for the first time I heard something under the anger, something closer to disbelief, that was curdling fast into fear. "You're replacing me with him, without a conversation, without a vote, there will be a vote," Roland said. "This is a formality before it, a formality." Elise's laugh had no humor in it. "You bring a stranger into my office with a sealed folder and water, gets thrown because I thought you sent an auditor to dig up something, to use against me before the board meeting. And now you're telling me it's worse than that. You already decided." I finally spoke. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I didn't even know your name until 30 seconds ago." She turned on me like I'd insulted her. "That makes it worse. You don't even know what you're stepping into." She was right, though neither of us knew it yet. Roland set a folder of his own on the desk, thicker than mine, tabbed official. "The board has reviewed 18 months of performance data across 4 divisions," he said. All four show consistent deterioration under Ms. Harrington's direct decisions. Margins down, retention down, 2 major accounts lost. The board is not comfortable with another quarter of this trajectory. Elise's jaw tightened. I made those decisions with the information I was given. Then perhaps the information was the problem, Roland said, and something in the way he said it smooth, rehearsed, a fraction too quick made me look at him a beat longer than I meant to. I asked to see the report. Roland hesitated, just slightly, before sliding it across the desk. I read fast. It's a skill you develop after enough years staring at collapsing balance sheets. You stop reading numbers as numbers and start reading them as behavior. 4 divisions. 4 different markets. 4 different management structures. 4 completely different operating conditions. And yet the pattern of decline across all 4 was nearly identical. Same slope. Same timing. Same shape. That doesn't happen by accident. Markets don't coordinate their failures. I didn't say anything yet. I've learned that the moment you announce what you've noticed, people start managing your perception of it instead of letting you keep looking. Elise noticed me looking, though. What? She said. Nothing yet, I said. Just reading. She studied me with new suspicion, not the reflexive hostility from before, but something more careful. Like she was recalculating what kind of threat I actually was. Roland cleared his throat. The board would like your assessment by Friday, Gideon. Whether you accept the position is, of course, your decision. But I'd ask that you review the materials with an open mind. I always do, I said. He left. Elise didn't. She stood there staring at the folder in my hands like it was something dangerous, which, as it turned out, it was. You're actually going to consider this, she said. It wasn't really a question. I'm going to look at the numbers, I said. That's all I've agreed to do. The numbers say I failed. The numbers say something, I said. I haven't decided yet what. She didn't like that answer, but she didn't argue with it either. I spent the next 2 days locked into the 4th floor data room the board had set up for me, going through 18 months of reports until my eyes burned. The deeper I went, the more that identical decline pattern bothered me. I pulled the divisional breakdowns apart and started tracing losses to their origin points, the specific decisions, the specific approvals, the specific signatures. That's when I found the first real contradiction. In 2 of the 4 divisions, losses attributed to strategic missteps under current leadership were dated the same week as gains, recorded in a separate cost center, a cost center that, on paper, had nothing to do with those divisions at all. Money and blame were moving in opposite directions at the exact same time, like a magic trick where the coin never actually leaves the magician's hand. It just changes which one you're watching. I requested access to the raw performance dashboard, the original, unprocessed operational data, before it got compiled into the quarterly reports Elise and the board had been reading. Roland refused. The compiled reports are the official record, he told me over the phone, his voice pleasant, unbothered. Raw feed access isn't standard for an incoming executive. That refusal told me more than anything in the folder had. If the board genuinely wanted an unbiased read on whether Elise had failed, there was no reason to keep the source data locked. You don't hide the ingredients unless you're worried about what they'll say about the meal. I went to Elise instead. I told her what I'd found: the matching decline curves, the reassigned losses, the refusal on the raw feed. I expected her to be defensive. Instead, something in her face cracked open. I asked for that same access 4 months ago, she said quietly. I was told the same thing you were. Did that seem strange to you? Everything about the last year has seemed strange to me, she said. I kept getting numbers that didn't match what I remembered approving. I'd flag it, and I'd get corrected figures back that made my concerns look like a misunderstanding. After the third time, I stopped flagging it. I didn't want the board thinking I couldn't read my own division's performance. That was the moment the ground under both of us shifted. She had assumed I'd arrived to finish what someone else had started. I had assumed she was simply a CEO whose decisions had genuinely tanked the company. Neither of those things, it turned out, was quite true. There's a secondary system, she said, lowering her voice like the walls themselves might report back to Roland. I found it, by accident, digging through an old server migration months ago. It's not supposed to still be active, but it is. It logs raw performance entries before anyone touches them. She gave me access that night off the books, on a laptop that had nothing to do with company property. What I found there didn't match the official reports. Not in the way of small clerical errors, in the way of a story being rewritten one classification at a time. Losses that belonged to other divisions were quietly reassigned to Elise's decisions. Gains that belonged to her division were quietly reassigned elsewhere. Someone had spent over a year sculpting a narrative, one line item at a time, and the sculpture they'd built was Elise Harrington, incompetent CEO. Someone wanted it to look like I failed, she said, and I watched a woman who'd spent the last hour treating me like an enemy realize in real time that we might be standing on the same side of something much larger. We need to find out who had the authority to make these reclassifications, I said. And we need to find out why. We traced the modification trail through the internal authorization chain over the following days, working the way you work when you no longer trust the front door carefully, quietly, checking each other's math. Every single change had been technically approved. Nothing illegal on its face, but the approvals all funneled through one executive office with the authority to reclassify financial data without triggering a standard audit flag. That office reported directly into the chairman's circle. The deeper we dug, the harder the company began to push back, not officially, never officially, but in the small ways that tell you someone is nervous. A board member I'd never met called me directly, warm and friendly on the surface, just wanting to welcome me to the process, and then spent 10 minutes asking pointed questions about why an outside consultant needed access to systems that weren't part of his mandate. I recognized the shape of it immediately. It's the same move I'd seen a dozen times in a dozen companies when people can't attack your findings. They start questioning your right to have found them at all. A rumor reached me by the end of that week, secondhand, that certain board members were suggesting my review had exceeded its scope, and that perhaps the chairman had made an error bringing in someone unfamiliar with the company's culture. I understood the message underneath the politeness. It wasn't really about scope. It was about making sure I got uncomfortable enough to stop looking before I found what I'd already started to find. I didn't stop. When I brought this to Roland, his mood shifted in a way I hadn't seen from him before. The polish cracked, just slightly. You were hired to stabilize this company, Gideon, he said, not to conduct an internal investigation into its history. If I take a position built on a version of events that isn't true, I told him, then I'm not stabilizing anything. I'm just the next person standing on top of the same lie. He didn't have an answer for that, which told me I was close to something he didn't want found. Elise, for her part, kept unraveling something harder than spreadsheets, her own account of the last year. I stopped fighting it, she admitted to me one night in the data room, the two of us surrounded by printouts neither of us should technically have had. Every time I pushed back on a number, I got a polished explanation that made me sound paranoid. Eventually, I just stopped. I told myself I was being efficient. I was actually just being managed. That admission cost her something. I could see it. A woman who had built her entire identity around Control was sitting across from me, admitting she'd been steered for months without knowing it. It would have been easy for her to keep performing certainty. She didn't. That told me who she actually was. Underneath the glass of water and the accusations, someone who'd rather face an ugly truth than keep living inside a comfortable lie. "Do you know what it's like?" she said, staring at the printouts instead of at me, "to start doubting whether you're actually good at your job. Not because you failed, because the ground kept moving under your feet and you couldn't prove it was moving. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning rebuilding the same numbers in my head, trying to find the mistake that had to be mine, because the alternative, that someone was doing this on purpose, felt too paranoid to say out loud. So I stopped saying it. I started apologizing for results I didn't actually create, because apologizing was easier than being the CEO who thought she was being sabotaged. "You weren't paranoid," I said. "You were early. There's a difference, even if it didn't feel like one at 4 in the morning." She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. I watched something in her shoulders loosen, just slightly, the particular relief of finally being believed by someone who had no reason to lie to her. Looking back, the signs had been there longer than I realized at the time, small things I'd registered without understanding their weight. A financial strategist who always seemed to know the contents of a report before it was officially circulated. A pattern of corrections that arrived suspiciously fast whenever Elise pushed back on a figure, as if someone had been waiting for the objection. A man who attended every meeting about the company's struggles but was never once named as a cause of them, in 18 months of documents that assigned blame to nearly everyone else. I hadn't connected any of it in the moment. It's only once you know where to look that scattered details stop looking like noise and start looking like a trail. The name came a few days later. Victor Langley, the company's chief financial strategist, a man I'd exchanged maybe 4 polite sentences within 3 weeks. The authorization trail for the reclassification system led straight through his office. On paper, his instructions appeared to originate from the chairman's directives. But paper isn't proof of intention. It's proof of a signature. Either Roland authorized this, I said to Elise, or Victor used Roland's authority without him fully understanding what it was being used for. Right now, I can't tell you which. Does it matter? She asked. Either way, someone decided I was expendable enough to sacrifice. It matters, I said, because one version means the chairman is complicit. The other means he's being played the same way you were. And I'm not walking into a CEO position without knowing which company I'd actually be running. I confronted Roland directly, laying out everything: the matching decline curves, the reclassifications, the trail leading to Victor's office under his authority. I watched him for a long moment before he finally exhaled and dropped the performance he'd been running since the day he called me. I suspected something was wrong 8 months ago, he admitted. Numbers that didn't sit right. Patterns I couldn't explain. But I couldn't investigate Elise publicly without triggering a full board revolt. Half of them were already looking for a reason to push her out. And if I'd said, I think someone is manipulating the data, it would have looked like I was protecting her, or worse, like I didn't have control of my own company. So you brought in an outsider, I said, with enough credibility to slide into her seat and quietly find out what you couldn't ask about out loud. I brought in the one person I knew could actually see the pattern, Roland said. I've read your work, Gideon. You don't fix companies by trusting the story you're handed. You fix them by finding the story underneath it. It was, in its own way, a compliment. It didn't make what he'd done to Elise any less costly. The deeper truth came together over the following week, piece by piece, the way real truths usually do, not in one dramatic confession, but in a slow accumulation of things that finally lined up. Victor Langley had built the reclassification system over a period of nearly a year, quietly manufacturing a leadership crisis. His goal wasn't personal cruelty toward Elise specifically, it was positioning. A CEO invisible freefall creates an opening. An opening creates restructuring. Restructuring creates new authority to hand out, and Victor intended to be the one holding the pen when it got handed out. Roland's authority had been used as cover, his signature attached to processes he'd approved in general terms without understanding the specific, surgical way they were being applied against Elise. Roland hadn't engineered her downfall, but he'd looked away from the warning signs for months because confronting them meant admitting he didn't fully control the company bearing his name. That failure was smaller than Victor's, but it was a failure all the same, and I told him so directly. You knew something was wrong, and you let a woman's reputation absorb the cost of your hesitation, I said. That's not neutral. That's a choice too. He didn't argue. There was a moment right before we took everything to the board, where the whole investigation nearly stalled for good. Victor got word I still don't know from whom, though I have suspicions that his authorization trail had been pulled and traced. He requested an emergency meeting with Roland alone, no notice given to me or Elise, and for almost 6 hours neither of us could reach the chairman at all. Elise paced the data room like she expected security to come escort us both out before we ever got the chance to present anything. I'll admit I felt the same pressure, though I didn't let it show. It's one thing to uncover the truth. It's another thing to get it in front of the people with the power to act on it before the person who built the lie finds a way to bury it deeper. Roland finally called that evening, his voice tighter than I'd heard it before. Victor had tried to convince him that my unauthorized access to the secondary system was the real scandal that I should be, the one facing scrutiny, not him. For one uncomfortable stretch of that call, I genuinely didn't know which way Roland would lean. A chairman protecting his own authorization signature over an outside consultant he'd known for 3 weeks wouldn't have been an unreasonable bet, and Victor clearly understood that. Show me everything again, Roland said instead. All of it. Tonight. Elise and I spent the next 4 hours walking him through every reclassified entry, every matched decline curve, every dated authorization, until there was nothing left in the story that could be explained any other way. By the time we finished, Roland sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. I built my reputation on being the one person in this building who couldn't be fooled, he said finally. I've spent 8 months being fooled anyway. That's a hard thing to sit with. It's harder for the person whose career you almost let him burn down to cover for it, I said. He didn't disagree. We brought everything to the board, the raw data trail, the matched decline patterns, the reclassification authorizations, Victor's fingerprints across every one of them. It wasn't a quiet meeting. Victor's composure lasted exactly as long as it took someone to read the first exhibit aloud. By the third, he'd stopped pretending there was an innocent explanation. The board moved fast once the truth was undeniable. Victor was removed, the matter referred for further review outside the company. He tried, right up until the last minute, to reframe himself as a man who'd simply been aggressive in protecting shareholder value, but there's no version of quietly rewriting a colleague's performance history that survives being said out loud in front of a full board. Roland stood in front of the same directors who had trusted his judgment for a decade and accepted responsibility for the months he'd spent avoiding a hard conversation instead of having one. It cost him something real. I watched 2 board members who had backed him without question for years look at him differently for the rest of that meeting. Trust, once you learn how easily it can be engineered, doesn't return to its old shape overnight, even for the people who did nothing wrong themselves. Elise was not simply handed her title back like nothing had happened, and I made sure of that, because pretending the last year hadn't occurred would have been its own kind of lie. She had to sit with the fact that she'd stopped questioning numbers that deserved to be questioned, that she'd let herself be managed into silence because silence felt safer than looking incompetent. That wasn't the same as being guilty of what Victor had built, but it wasn't Nothing either, and to her credit, she didn't ask for it to be waved away. I own the part that was mine, she told the board, her voice steady in a way I respected. I stopped pushing when I should have kept pushing. That's on me. The rest of it was never mine to own, and I'm done carrying it. When the board formally offered me the CEO position, I didn't take it. Not right away. I told them the truth that I wasn't willing to sit in a chair that had been emptied out through manipulation, not manufactured competition. If the board wanted a leader who understood how to actually see a company instead of the story printed about it, they needed to reckon fully with how close they'd come to destroying the wrong person over it first. They did. It took another difficult meeting, but they did. Elise found me afterward, alone in the office where all of this had started. The same desk, the same window looking out over Charlotte. I owe you an apology, she said, for the water, for assuming the worst the second you walked in. You didn't know what I was there for, I said. Neither did I, if I'm honest. You weren't wrong to be afraid. You were wrong about who to be afraid of. She almost smiled at that. When Roland said you were here for my job, I thought I understood exactly what kind of man had just walked into my office. I was wrong about that too. I wasn't sent to take your job, I said. I was sent to find out whether you actually deserve to lose it. Those aren't the same thing, even if they looked identical from where you were standing. They don't anymore, she said. I ended up taking a different role than either of us expected, not her replacement but alongside her, restructuring the systems that had made this kind of manipulation possible in the first place, so that no future executive would ever again be handed a story about their own failure without the ability to check whether it was true. The board created the position, specifically for that purpose. An oversight role with real authority behind it, something between a partner and a safeguard. It wasn't the job Roland had originally dangled in front of me, and it was better. Elise kept her position, rebuilt with a board that finally understood what they'd almost let happen to her. And for the first time in over a year, she ran her divisions on numbers she actually trusted. The board member who'd called to question my scope never called again. I heard, secondhand, that he'd been among the loudest voices pushing to remove Elise before any of this came to light. I never confirmed it, and I didn't need to. Some things explain themselves once the noise around them goes quiet. Elise and I ended up working closely over the following months, rebuilding the reporting infrastructure line by line. And somewhere in that process, the wariness between us turned into something closer to respect, then something closer to a genuine partnership. She started sitting in on my reviews not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand the patterns I saw before anyone tried to hide them from her again. I found myself, more than once, thinking that the version of her who'd thrown that glass of water had been protecting something worth protecting. She just hadn't known yet who the real threat was. I closed out the last of the paperwork on the oversight role late that evening, alone in an office that finally felt like it belonged to something honest. Whatever this company became next, it would at least become it on numbers nobody had quietly reshaped behind closed doors, and there was a satisfaction in that I hadn't expected to feel this deeply. I'd walked in 3 weeks earlier, expecting a consulting conversation and a quick read on a struggling division. I was leaving with something closer to a second career, built not on replacing a woman the board had been sold a false story about, but on making sure no one else ever got handed that same false story again. I called my daughter that first night after the board meeting, the one where Victor's manipulation was finally laid bare in front of everyone who trusted his numbers for a year. She asked how the big scary meeting went, the same easy way she always did. The two of us trading stories about our respective work the way we'd made a habit of over the years. I told her it went the way it was supposed, to slower than I wanted, harder than it needed to be, but honest by the end. She laughed and said that sounded like most things in our life. She wasn't wrong. I think about that first afternoon, sometimes the water on my collar, the silence I refused to fill, the sentence that sounded like an ending and turned out to be the opposite. Roland had told her I was there for her job. What he never said, because even he didn't fully understand it yet, was that I was really there for the truth underneath it, and that in the end, the truth was the only thing either of us had actually been fighting for all along.